So, in my last video, I tried to talk about living honestly. For our own health and for the health of the culture around us, I think it's important that we avoid doing things that negatively impact our integrity. That whole video was essentially an intro into this one, because I'm to the point personally where I just can't wear a mask anymore in good conscience. But instead of taking this video to argue about whether or not masks work, I'd like to pose the question this way. When do we stop wearing masks, and what's the criteria we use to make that decision? I think it's important that we hammer this out because the debate seems to be largely dominated by emotional reasoning and political identities. And I'm afraid that we're approaching a situation where no one knows how to stop clapping for Stalin. Now, that might sound a little bit dramatic, but actually I think that analogy works just fine. In a world with clearly defined wrongthink, what starts as a great idea can quickly become exhausting when there's no clear stopping point. The established narrative is that it's a simple equation. Wearing a mask equals saving lives. And I'm pretty confident that it's not that simple. First, let's talk about common sense. I'm no scientist, but my degree is in biology. And it isn't clear to me how much wearing those cotton rectangles actually stops an airborne virus that's 120 nanometers. The response I often hear is, well, it helps with droplet spread. And it might, a little bit. Here's an image that shows how much droplet spread there still is, even with a mask. But even if you could eliminate all droplet spread, it still isn't clear how much that would work. I have yet to see a study done on the proportion of spread rates between airborne and droplet spreads. And on top of that, there's a host of other concerns. The amount at which we're reusing masks and touching them at best reduces their effectiveness, and at worst spreads COVID faster. So it would seem to me that the mask question is far from settled. Now, I've had this conversation fairly regularly, and it's at this point that nearly everyone I talk to defaults to an appeal to authority. They say something along the lines of, well, since I'm not a scientist, what good's my common sense? We'll stop when the science says that we should. But nothing's ever that cut and dry. Scientists rarely agree with each other, and neither science or policymaking happens in a vacuum. I am a fan of the scientific method. I think that it's built specifically to minimize bias. But the scientific community is still made up of people. People that choose what to investigate, how to test, what to publish, and what publications are worth acting on. And when the scientific community is nestled inside such a politically charged culture, it gets tainted with cultural concerns along with everything else. I think that the hubbub around hydroxychloroquine makes for a great example. We've heard from Dr. Risch, who is an epidemiologist, a virologist, and he sits on the board of multiple medical journals. So arguably, he's an expert as much as anyone. And he's written several articles about the public treatment of hydroxychloroquine. He would argue that there is plenty of good evidence that it makes a significant difference in outcomes when given early enough in the treatment of COVID. However, he says that instead of embracing hydroxychloroquine as a potential treatment, it's shunned by the medical community for reasons that are largely political. So it's possible in this case that Trump derangement syndrome itself is costing lives. I'll leave this article in the link in the description. But honestly, it gets even more complicated than that, because not only do political concerns affect science, but that science then goes on to affect politics. While lockdown and mask mandates may be effective, it's obviously a matter of degrees, which then begs the question, how effective should a measure be before it warrants a mandate? Or at least I would think that would be the next question, because that would imply that there's some balance to be had. Again, nothing happens in a vacuum. Lockdowns affect the economy, which isn't a nebulous force. The economy is people and their quality of life. Without people, there wouldn't be an economy. And then as far as masks go, they affect our ability to communicate with people, our facial expressions, our body language. It affects our perceived level of isolation. But these are the concerns of economists and psychologists, not necessarily the epidemiologists. The old saying is something like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is exactly the reason that we don't elect scientists. They can make whatever recommendation best covers their butts, and ideally it would be considered, but only as part of a practical, balanced proposals that come from our leadership. But this isn't exactly what we have today. As I said earlier, the discussion around COVID is driven largely by emotional appeals. The most common that I hear is, if it saves one life, then it's worth it. And this is frankly a ridiculous perspectiveless standard. First of all, it's not like any of us are getting out alive anyway. Risk is inherent in anything that we do, and we balance that risk versus what's practical within our own comfort zones. But this particular argument doesn't have any balance, and we know it doesn't because we don't apply it anywhere else, and that's for plenty good reason. Firstly, it's not a given that mandates do more good than they do harm. Let me switch articles here. As I said, it's hard to quantify feelings of isolation or increase in depression or suicide, but that doesn't mean that we just discount it either. I can say from personal experience that the added restrictions have drastically reduced the quality of medical care across the board. My grandma passed just this August after spending several weeks in a hospital that I have previously had good experiences with. But this time it was different. The care that she got was frankly pitiful, and she didn't have COVID, and the hospital was far from overloaded with COVID patients. The only difference was the added restrictions that interfered with the normal course of care. And secondly, the reason this argument doesn't work is because we're setting a precedent of lowering the quality of life for everyone for the sake of a few, which might sound great in the midst of a nearsighted moral panic, but in the long term, we risk further limiting our autonomy. And finally, it doesn't get us any closer to answering our initial question. When do we stop, and what's the criteria with which we make that decision? Is there an answer? I would argue that we should stop today. In fact, I'll make a commitment to stopping today. I believe that the masks and social distancing mandates are largely empty gestures. I think they're in place less because of their effectiveness and more for political reasons. I think that they allow bureaucrats to say that they're doing something, and many of us just continue in the political theater for social reasons. I get it that it feels weird to be the odd man out, and we're told that perpetuating the false security for those that want it is the thing that's loving and kind. And I frankly disagree. I think that while a friend might tell you what you want to hear, it's a good friend that'll have conversations that are hard. I would argue that the healthiest thing for our culture is for us to live in truth. It's better for those that are at risk to actually take precautions than for everyone else to pretend to. And here's where my previous video comes in. We may not always know what's best, but we do know what feels hypocritical. I see people out in the stores that wear their masks on their chin or below their nose, or they'll pull it down to talk to you. And I see people who social distance only on Sunday mornings. And I think that if you are one of those people, I would humbly encourage you to work on improving your integrity, and be ready to give an honest answer as to why you don't wear a mask and you aren't going to social distance. Like the greengrocer that displays a seemingly innocuous slogan, what we're really displaying is not that we care for others, but that we're willing to submit to social pressures. And by not wearing one, we can stop contributing to the backdrop of lies around us, and we can stop further isolating the people around us that actually feel the same as we do. However, I would also say that if you believe that you should be wearing a mask, I would love to hear your opinion as to what criteria we should be using to determine when we stop, or if we ever should. But I would also encourage you to stay strong in your convictions as well. I would encourage you to wear it boldly, wear it faithfully, and wear it correctly. My main concern in this video isn't winning the mask argument, but it is about not letting COVID make liars out of us on both sides of the aisle.